The largest volcanic canyon in the world is located in southern Iceland. I know you all were wondering. Eltcow, I believe that's how it's pronounced. I looked it up many places. It's not at all how it's spelled, but that's Icelandic language for you. Eltcow is a popular tourist destination with many beautiful waterfalls and hiking trails. And you can get there pretty much only if you have a four-wheel drive car that you've rented if you're visiting, or you take a tour. And when you get there, there's pretty much nothing else. Just God's beautiful, beautiful nature. Not even a souvenir shop.
Wow.
And so, several years ago, when a tour bus stopped and everybody got off and took pictures and roamed around a while, and then they realized that one of their passengers was missing, it was understandable that everyone began to panic. The missing passenger was described as being an Asian woman wearing dark clothes who spoke English really well. And all of the passengers had their generous hearts and decided they needed to search for this woman. And the bus driver, and they searched and searched, and then the police came and they searched, wondering, did she fall in a ravine? Had she somehow fallen unconscious? Was she hurt someplace? And how far away had she wandered? Was she lost? Where was she? Because there was no place really to hide. And they searched and searched until about 3 a.m., right before the Coast Guard was about ready to send up a helicopter. Did they realize that this missing passenger had been right with them the whole time? You see, at a previous stop, this woman had gotten off the bus and changed her clothes.
That's not good.
And the other passengers didn't notice and didn't recognize her in her new outfit.
Oh, dear.
And when she heard the description of the missing woman, well, that didn't sound like her. So she was in the search party with everybody else. I am certain that when they got back on the bus, there was a lot of laughter and a lot of rejoicing. It's such a relief to be found, and it's a blessing to be back where you belong. But there were probably those who were grumbling, because it seems like it was a big waste of time. But there are always those who will grumble at another person's joy. Our gospel passage from Luke this morning begins with grumbling. And it's not really surprising that it was the Pharisees and scribes grumbling. They're pretty good at that. They have a lot of practice. You see, what had been going on was an increasing amount of tax collectors who were working for the Romans and working for themselves, and then others who were considered to be sinners, or even those considered unclean, were getting really interested in what Jesus had to say. And so Jesus had the nerve to sit down and talk with them. And he had the audacity to even eat with them, which was a big deal back then. And the Pharisees and scribes who saw this were appalled. He's doing what? He's gone too far. You see, the reason they were were appalled, besides just being snobs, was that the Jewish people had been through a lot. They had gone through slavery in Egypt. They had been captives in Babylonia during the exile. And now the Romans were occupying their land. And what most Jewish people thought the problem was that whenever their people stopped following God's rules or God's laws, that God just sort of went, let it happen. It's your fault for disobeying me. And so people like the Pharisees, who really were into rule following, who really found their identity in being good and righteous, and so they were pleasing God, they tended to blame all of their troubles on those tax collector traders and those unclean sinners. Often the way we see even today when self-identified religious leaders get on the news and blame natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes on people who have different political views or different values than they do. It's all God's wrath. That's what they say. And so, when these Pharisees and scribes saw this happening, saw Jesus betraying them almost by eating with those people who were so beneath them, they were a little ticked. And they grumbled. And Jesus heard them. And so Jesus responded to them by telling them a few parables. We just get the first two today, but there's another one that you probably are fairly familiar with that comes right after. But in these two parables, as he's sharing them, you sense Jesus' snarky sense of humor. Because he sort of jabs at the Pharisees and the scribes in subtle ways that we might not quite catch right away. Because he tells them, what do you do when you lose a sheep? Asking them to imagine they're shepherds. And the shepherds at the time were considered pretty low class. They were considered smelly, untrustworthy scoundrels, where people would just watch them walk by and be like, ew. They weren't even allowed to testify in court. And so Jesus is telling these uppity, self-righteous Pharisees, when you're like a shepherd, I'm sure that went over really well. And then in the next parable, Jesus says, when you're like a woman, that's not much better. So he got their attention. But then if you notice in both of these stories, the sheep and the coin don't do anything. They do zip, zilch, nada, zero. They are just lost. Unlike the woman in Iceland, they couldn't even get up and go searching for themselves, could they? They're just there. But we hear that in both of these parables, it is the shepherd and or the woman who goes searching for them. And when they find them, they are thrilled and they rejoice and they bring them home and then they call up all their friends or post about it on Facebook and Instagram and invite everyone to come and celebrate with them. Because that which has always belonged to them is now back in place. I think what Jesus is trying to teach the Pharisees and the scribes and us is that God's love is not a transaction. Often we imagine it is. But really, our value in God's eyes has nothing to do with what we do, what we say, or even, frankly, what we believe. Because we can never do any of those things adequately. None of us can. We so often ask ourselves, though, what we need to do to be good enough. How can we be deserving of mercy? Especially on days when we're feeling particularly lost. What do we need to do in order to be found? But Jesus tells us through Luke's gospel that just like that sheep and that coin, it's not up to us. God comes to find us. God will not stop searching or sweeping the house until we are back where we belong. And while it's true and good that we can respond to this most amazing grace and unconditional love by being responsible, by living generously, by loving with no exceptions, as we are called to do. The fact is we can't do any of those things enough. And we rely on our intrinsic value being based solely upon who we belong to. And we belong to the one who does not stop looking for us until we are home. And then Jesus goes on to tell us that all of heaven and the angels rejoice when one sinner repents. Well, the word in the original Greek for repent is metanoia. You heard that word before? If you had to take Latin or Greek ever, meta means change. Noia means thinking. To repent is to change our thinking, to change the way we see things, to change the way we think and see about ourselves. So heaven celebrates when we can see how we fit in the way that we always have. God throws a party when we realize that we are worthy because of who we belong to, not because of what we do. That woman who was lost in Iceland, when she was able to change her thinking, when she was able to see herself in a new way, when the other passengers could see in a new way who she was, they could see that she was right where she belonged. She was no longer lost but found, as are we. In Luke's gospel this morning, Jesus is calling upon those of us who grumble, those of us who are trained to have transactional attitudes and inclinations, who think it's all about what we do. And Jesus calls upon those of us who just sometimes feel lost to have a metanoia experience. Jesus calls upon us to repent, to see each other, to see ourselves in a different way, to see each other and ourselves the way that Jesus sees us, as beloved children of God. And Jesus invites us all, then welcomes us to his table, to eat with him, to celebrate that he has found us. And then welcomes us to God's party, where we belong, because it's right where we're supposed to be. Amen.
Amen. A true pastor.